Thank you, Kat, for that very lovely introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. A very hard act to follow. And so, yeah, thanks, Kat, for positioning me here. I would like to thank Karen and Kat Kramer for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful afternoon. I'd like to thank the Sunset-Gower Studios and Terry Marconi and Regence Barker for putting together a lovely afternoon. I'd like to give them a round of applause. As Kat mentioned, I'm Vice President at Participant Media, and Jeff Skull, when he started the company, did it with the intention of making films that would inspire and compel social change. And when I first read that mission statement, I thought, well, Stanley Kramer did that, with all of his films. And I think that Kat taking this next step of launching these series of films and tagging into a current human rights issue with an NGO is not only a logical step, it's a very important step, and I think your father would be very, very proud of you. As she mentioned, I spent 7 years at Amnesty International, and my very first week there, I was handed 2 cases as part of our campaign to raise awareness about ending violence against women around the world. And the 2 cases had to focus on sexual violence being perpetrated by Russian soldiers against Chechen women. And the second one was about sexual violence in the most extreme form against women in the Congo. And when I was reading the cases, I was still haunted by these stories, and they were the very first ones that I worked on. And on the Congo story, it was about a grandmother, a mother, and a granddaughter who had all been gang raped for hours by Congolese rebel forces. And I was reading this, and the little girl was 5 years old, and her name was Precious. And after that experience, she never again spoke. She was so traumatized. And when I started at Amnesty, my daughter was 5 years old. And she was sitting with me. She was in kindergarten, and she was sitting with me, and I was reading this case, and I looked at her, and I thought, how do I tackle this? The capacity for human beings to perpetrate the kind of violence and brutality, how do we tackle this? And as I kept reading the case file, I read about the lone doctor in the Congo who would go village to village to treat these women. I read about the nurse from Rwanda that came in to help the women. I read about the villagers who themselves had been victims of sexual violence, who then took in the little girls who had been raped and their mothers had been killed. And I knew that the capacity for human compassion far outweighed the brutality that we perpetrate against each other. And the world turned its back for 20 years on the Congo. The press didn't cover it. The public didn't know about it. There were cries for help. These women suffered in silence for 20 years, screaming in silence, and nobody heard. But there were those NGOs on the ground who were trying to raise awareness and doing the work that they so desperately needed support from the rest of the world. And you will hear from one of those organizations tonight. I have the great privilege of knowing John Prendergast and Gail Smith, who started Enough Project. And they've launched a campaign called Raise Hope for Congo, and you will hear from one of their campaign ambassadors shortly. And before I introduce Emmanuel, I want to read a quote from the Talmud because I think it's very appropriate. We just had Passover, we just had Easter, we're seeing Yentl, nothing's impossible, and it's one of my favorite quotes. It says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." And this is the point that I want to make. We can't fix the problems in the Congo. That is up to the Congolese people. It is up to the Congolese government. But what we can do, what we should do, and what we are obligated to do are help those women and girls who have been victims for far too long, so that 5-year-old little girls who are named Precious don't have to fear violence, but they should be focusing on what all 5-year-old little girls should be focusing on, which is going to school, playing with their dolls, and having fun with their mother and grandmother. So I thank you for coming today, and I would encourage you to please support the important work of Enough Project.